Hello, friends. It's Lucas here. Today, we're diving into the world of RPGs. What exactly are role-playing games? Which titles became iconic representatives of the genre? And why is one studio, closely associated with these games, still considered one of the best RPG developers? Try to think of at least 10 games from this genre. You'll probably recognize a few from this studio. However, if you take a deeper look at its history, it becomes clear that luck hasn't always been on their side. But we'll talk about that a bit later. Role-playing games, or the RPG genre. What makes them so captivating? Why do players love them so much? And why, despite this, do they remain in a narrow niche? They have their own dedicated audience, but only a few projects manage to attract the attention of a mass audience. Some might argue, what are you talking about? Look at Baldur's Gate 3, almost 1 million players online on Steam. Or Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, where hundreds of thousands play simultaneously. Starfield, 300,000! Wait, what? It looks like Todd Howard has a secret bot army hidden somewhere. But if we set Starfield aside, there's Fallout 4. Many players are still crazy about Skyrim. There's The Witcher. There are games from BioWare, though their latest releases are better avoided. Yes, I'm obviously referring to Dragon Age the Veilguard and Mass Effect Andromeda. Yes, these are role-playing games, but they are moving further away from the RPG genre. Except, of course, for Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 has become a real anomaly, largely because it's a classic old-school RPG. It's a game where anything is possible, solving problems through dialogue, developing characters in different ways, completing the campaign in various ways, being either a good guy or a complete villain. In short, Baldur's Gate 3 has truly won over a huge number of players. Much of the game's success is also tied to its co-op mode. Playing it with friends is incredibly fun. Additionally, the game supports mods, and mods are the key to longevity, as Todd Howard would confirm. Although even full mod support doesn't always guarantee success. So, if you've already worn out Baldur's Gate 3 and want to play something just as old school, what can you think of? Well, you don't have to look far. Divinity Original Sin 2 is also a fantastic classic RPG from the same studio, Larian, that brought us Baldur's Gate 3. Some even say that Original Sin 2 is better than Baldur's Gate 3 in some aspects. Honestly, they're right. The combat system and freedom of choice in Divinity really offer more room for creativity and tactics. And yes, Divinity is also much harder in terms of combat difficulty. I literally spent hours in front of the mirror with Los, tweaking builds for new bosses to account for all weaknesses and exploit every opportunity for victory. By the way, we can recall the remarkable RPG Disco Elysium, which has no combat but features a protagonist from the multiverse and a unique idea of perceiving the world through this character. It's also an outstanding project. Unfortunately, the developer studio Zaum has had a very sad fate. There were disagreements, scandals, money issues, and all that. I would definitely play a second part. There's also the studio Owlcat Games, which creates some of the best role-playing games. If we're talking about classic RPGs with small characters, they first released Pathfinder Kingmaker. Then came Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. The story here is amazing. Every dialogue choice affects the course of events, and moral dilemmas and opportunities for manipulation make the game a true epic for fans of deep RPGs. The combat system here is much more complex and strategic than in most games. Character classes, tactical decisions, and environmental interactions play a key role, and the system itself resembles D&D, adding depth to the game and requiring careful preparation to achieve victory. By the way, Pathfinder is also a tabletop game that branched off from D&D and placed a strong emphasis on detailed character customization and numerous options for creating unique builds. For those who don't know, D&D is the foundation on which the mechanics of Baldur's Gate 3 are built, so there's a lot in common between them. Now, additionally, Owlcat Games has released the magnificent Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, with dialogues in the style of Warhammer, where every conversation turns into almost a whole book, and then it all comes together into a massive, multi-volume work. And this isn't a flaw, as it's probably the only Warhammer game that allows you to explore the Warhammer 40,000 universe from top to bottom with all its details. In this game, you can create any kind of hero who solves problems in their own way, as well as assemble a unique party of fascinating characters who find themselves in an extremely difficult situation. Some might mention Warhammer Space Marine 2, but I'll say this, it lets you look at this universe, but not truly understand it. Overall, the projects by Owlcat Games are also worth checking out. If you enjoy old-school role-playing games where you make decisions, with a strong focus on story and a variety of ways to solve problems through character development, then this is definitely for you. Of course, we can't overlook BioWare, a studio beloved by many. They are the creators of the first two Baldur's Gate games, as well as Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Neverwinter Nights, titles known to everyone. Additionally, they have the Mass Effect trilogy, Dragon Age Origins, and Dragon Age 2. And the rest, perhaps, isn't even worth mentioning. Mentioning BioWare now feels a bit embarrassing because it was once a great studio, and tomorrow Electronic Arts might announce its closure. Who knows? At the same time, when we talk about role-playing games, they should have certain features. I want to role-play in the game. Here, I want to be a good guy. And there, a villain. Here, I want to focus on conversational skills, and there, to be a dumb warrior. Not just choose from the standard archetypes. Stealth assassin, strong assassin, or magic assassin. There's already plenty of that everywhere. But a role-playing game allows me to truly solve problems in diverse ways. And if we start compiling a list of worthy adventures in unusual worlds, with memorable stories, interesting playthrough variations, and unique opportunities that affect the plot, then both Fallout games will undoubtedly make it onto this list. It's important to note that it's specifically the first two Fallout games that fit this criterion, while the others don't quite make the cut. There's also Planescape Torment, also from Black Isle Studios. Later, Black Isle went bankrupt, and Troika Games emerged in its place. They created Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, as well as the Temple of Elemental Evil, though the latter isn't the best example and is usually forgotten. And they created Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. 2 out of their 3 games later became cult classics because they offered incredible variability, amazing opportunities, and, without exaggeration, unforgettable worlds. In short, these games truly left a mark on many people, became cult classics, and are still supported and expanded by fans to this day. Well, and then Troika Games, of course, went bankrupt, and from its ashes emerged the team Obsidian. And now we've reached the main focus of this video, Obsidian and its list of worthy role-playing adventures. And at the very least, Fallout New Vegas will make it onto this list, which some consider the best 3D Fallout. I certainly enjoy Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, but they are, first and foremost, solid open-world grindfests. A true role-playing game with a deep story, however, is Fallout New Vegas. Fallout New Vegas is that very game where you can create any kind of hero, just like in the first and second Fallout, and the world will react to your character. It's a project where choosing a faction plays a crucial role. Here, most tasks can be solved through dialogue rather than violence, though brute force is always an option. It's that very game you want to dive into again and again, discovering new possibilities each time. But unfortunately, not everything went smoothly. The game didn't bring financial success to Obsidian because they signed a contract with Todd Howard and Bethesda. The agreement tied the game's financial success to its Metacritic score. It was stated that if the game scored 85 out of 100, they would receive royalties. In the end, the game received 84 points on Metacritic. And all of this was due to the game's terrible technical state, which was released with a huge number of bugs. Damn, it's a brilliant role-playing game, but its creators, after the financial failure, for themselves of course, not for Bethesda, found themselves at a crossroads. The studio was almost shut down, a studio with a very complicated fate. It always teetered on the edge, yet managed to create high-quality and interesting games with unconventional ideas. Moreover, these ideas are perhaps appreciated even more today than at the time of their release. Let's start with Obsidian's first game, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords. It had a compelling theme, tied to a dark storyline and complex questions about the light and dark sides of the Force. I'd even say it's a sober-minded take on the Star Wars universe, where the creators deeply explored its darker aspects. The game is loved largely for this grim narrative. Many consider it one of the best role-playing games. Now let's move on to the next project developed by Obsidian, which turned out to be much better than its predecessor. This is Neverwinter Nights 2. Neverwinter Nights is, first and foremost, a deep role-playing game that can still be recommended today to those who are passionate about the RPG genre. It offers diverse character development, multiple decision-making options, and of course, a deep storyline. Let's move on to the next project from Obsidian. This game truly deserves a full remake or reimagining. We're talking about the spy RPG Alpha Protocol. On one hand, I really like the idea of a spy role-playing game with moral dilemmas, betrayals, double games, and a complex spy network. But on the other hand, the mechanics were quite rough, barely functional, and the game was riddled with bugs. As you immersed yourself in the atmosphere, ideas, story, and unexpected plot twists. But the mechanics were frustrating. Alpha Protocol, like many other Obsidian games, felt unfinished. It was clear that they didn't have enough time or budget to polish the project. It's also worth noting that Alpha Protocol had rights issues, as Sega was the publisher. It's unclear who owns the rights now, but I'd love to see an updated version of the game. Obsidian also worked on Dungeon Siege 3, for reference. The first and second Dungeon Siege games are decent Diablo clones. Dungeon Siege 3 by Obsidian is an excellent role-playing adventure with solid combat mechanics, almost bug-free and well-polished. And, it must be said, it has a rather interesting story, where the antagonist doesn't come across as a straightforward villain, a very intriguing character. The problem with Obsidian was that it always took on ambitious projects, but often with limited resources. It was a company with talented people, but they didn't always manage to implement everything they envisioned. For example, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic was developed by just 20 people in a year and a half. It's clear that due to time constraints, many ideas had to be cut, and many elements remained unfinished. Then, just 2 years later, in 2006, they released Neverwinter Nights 2, which became one of the most expansive RPGs in terms of story. 4 years later, they were simultaneously working on Alpha Protocol, Fallout New Vegas, and Dungeon Siege. The gap between these games was just a few months. Alpha Protocol came out in May 2010, Fallout New Vegas followed in October of the same year, and Dungeon Siege 3 was released in May 2011. This was a studio that was always on the edge. They struggled with funding, took on external projects, and often received budgets that were too small to fully realize their vision. When the money ran out, they had to scramble to find a new publisher. They kept jumping from one company to another, but never managed to land favorable deals. They couldn't create that one breakout project that would give them true independence. These guys were constantly in survival mode, and then, in 2014, Obsidian unexpectedly released one of their finest role-playing games. The South Park, The Stick of Truth is the best example of adapting the South Park universe into a game. This game isn't just good, it's also quite provocative. The script, of course, was written with the involvement of the creators of the original animated series, which gave the game a unique charm. However, Obsidian acted as an excellent executor in this project, creating a solid foundation that made the Stick of Truth engaging and interesting for players. After South Park, Obsidian was on the verge of shutting down. The money ran out. They worked with other people's franchises, used other people's engines and brands. Yet, they created some of the most iconic RPGs in history, but constantly faced financial difficulties. At some point, the situation became critical, and to survive, the company had to turn to Kickstarter, which was just gaining popularity at the time. Obsidian announced that they would create a classic RPG with extensive text, multiple branching paths, player choice, and a third-person perspective. Everything that fans loved them for, a dark atmosphere and a deep story. At that point, the studio had raised enough funds to finally bring their ambitious idea to life, to create the most expansive RPG. On Kickstarter, they raised $4 million, and the team felt they had free reign. They decided to make the game much larger and more interesting, with hundreds of hours of content. However, as often happens, they once again miscalculated the budget. When they finished the quest system for the first city, it became clear that the project needed to be wrapped up because the money was almost gone. The problem was that Pillars of Eternity was originally envisioned as a much larger game than it turned out to be. But after completing work on the first city, they realized. To continue, they would need to create 2 more cities like it. In the end, they decided to scale back. Either way, Pillars of Eternity resonated with many players. The game left a lasting impression. The atmosphere, story, and world, all of it was harsh and dark, giving it a unique flavor. People were glad that the game was released, and Obsidian could finally say that their efforts paid off and they managed to earn something. Then, with the support of Paradox Interactive, Obsidian released the RPG Tyranny. It wasn't overly large in scale, but it was an excellent game with a compelling story. Set in a fantasy world where the villain had already won, you play as their envoy sent to a conquered region to deal with a rebellion. The quests were interesting. With a fresh take on the fantasy theme, a niche group of players really enjoyed it, even though it was clear the project had a limited budget. Still, it was very engaging to play. Commercially, however, the game flopped. Next came Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, which also failed commercially. Unfortunately, game didn't live up to expectations, despite Obsidian's attempts to add pirate adventure elements. The game failed to gain widespread popularity. But again, as an RPG, it wasn't bad. At that time, the studio was trying to replicate its past successes, which wasn't the right approach, and Larian Studios with Divinity Original Sin 2 demonstrated that copying old game formulas and making classic isometric games wasn't the way forward. To succeed, they needed to move forward, explore new approaches, and experiment. Divinity introduced a unique combat system with the ability to interact with the environment, destroy objects, use items to solve puzzles, and change the course of events. The world reacted to your actions instead of remaining static, as in older RPGs. It was a real breakthrough. Divinity Original Sin 2 was so good that it won numerous awards and was named Game of the Year. All this freedom, supported by a skill check system, allowed players to feel real control over the situation, something many games of that time lacked. Here, an interesting comparison can be made between two companies, Obsidian Entertainment and Larian Studios, which chose different paths of development. Obsidian opted for stability and repeating successful formulas, while Larian took the path of experimentation and innovation. If you look at the Divinity series, starting from the first part and ending with Original Sin 2, you can see a huge leap in progress. All of this is the result of a desire to improve, to seek new ideas and solutions. And if you take Baldur's Gate 3, its development became a continuation of the same philosophy, to seek something unique, going beyond the usual. Obsidian, despite creating excellent RPGs, at some point decided to follow a proven path. With the first Pillars of Eternity, the studio saw that a strategy with a classic approach resonated with players and continued to develop this concept in their subsequent projects. But the question arises, is such a strategy what players need? The answer is obvious. If you just want a good RPG, then yes. But if you're striving for something new and unusual, this approach no longer satisfies. Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, and Pillars of Eternity 2 were high-quality games, but they didn't offer players anything truly unique that could change the perception of the genre. This is why the last two Obsidian games failed to achieve commercial success. Here, we see how important risk-taking and a willingness to experiment are if you want to offer players not just a quality product, but something that will truly leave a mark. And once again, the company that has released many great games finds itself at a crossroads, struggling financially and without a dollar to its name. Once again, Obsidian found itself on the brink of survival, and this time, it was supported by Take-Two. And importantly, the studio didn't disappoint and brilliantly handled the task. This is how The Outer Worlds came to be. Not the largest in scale, but undoubtedly an engaging RPG. The game quickly gained popularity thanks to its sharp black humor, excellent combat system, and variety of playthrough options. Players were offered a whole world with unique characters ranging from amusing to highly controversial, which added a special charm to the project. What I especially like about The Outer Worlds is its intimacy. The game doesn't aim for epic scale or grandeur, but that's precisely its charm. It's fast-paced, with a unique visual style that, despite the modest budget, feels original and appealing. The locations aren't always grandiose, but the atmosphere is conveyed very well overall, and the black humor that permeates the entire game makes it even more memorable. And now we've reached the present day, and all the significant RPGs created by Obsidian have already been mentioned. But it's important to note that the company realized it couldn't continue like this. In 2018, a turning point came. Microsoft, as part of its strategy to expand exclusive content for Xbox and Game Pass, acquired Obsidian Entertainment. This move was significant, as the studio now gained access to much broader resources and support. After this acquisition, Obsidian continued to develop its projects, but with much greater potential. Microsoft provided the studio with everything it needed to create ambitious games, allowing the developers to no longer face financial constraints. This, in turn, gave the studio the freedom to experiment and bring ideas to life on a whole new level, undoubtedly opening new horizons in their creativity. However, despite all the lessons Obsidian learned over the years, the studio unfortunately didn't draw the right conclusions. At some point, they decided that if only a handful of their RPGs had been truly successful, then the genre must no longer be in demand. Instead of continuing to develop their strengths in role-playing games and exploring new horizons, they concluded that games in this genre no longer appealed to a broad audience. This mistake may have been a result of the studio being forced to teeter on the edge of survival for too long, lacking stable resources and clear strategic direction. After Obsidian came under Microsoft's wing, the studio temporarily stepped away from its usual RPG themes and decided to try something new. This is how Grounded came to be, a cooperative survival game where players find themselves in a world full of giant insects playing as miniature humans. Despite mixed reviews and criticism from some fans, the game found its audience. Many players, including those skeptical of Microsoft's decisions, were pleased with its dynamic gameplay, creative mechanics, and the ability to play with friends. Grounded showed that Obsidian is capable of creating interesting projects in different genres, even if they're not RPGs. After completing work on Grounded, the studio set its sights on something completely different: Pentiment. This is an intimate adventure that takes players to medieval Europe, where they must investigate a murder in a small town. Although Pentiment didn't become a super hit or attract millions of fans, the game left its mark. It wasn't a project for a mass audience, nor was it aimed at huge sales. Unlike multi-million-dollar blockbusters, Pentiment stood out with its unique atmosphere, unusual style, and unconventional approach to solving crimes in a medieval setting, despite its limited commercial success. Against the backdrop of experiments with new genres such as Grounded and Pentiment, Obsidian continued to move forward, trying its hand at diverse projects. But in 2020, when everyone had already appreciated their ambitious steps in other genres, the studio returned to its roots, deciding to create a major RPG once again. And so, that same year, they announced their new project, Avowed. This trailer became a real event for Obsidian fans and all RPG enthusiasts. When the teaser for Avowed appeared online, everyone immediately noticed the captivating atmosphere, which promised to be dark and serious. Many saw it as Skyrim 2. This was exactly what people had been waiting for from Obsidian after their work on Tyranny, something dark with a deep role-playing system, possibly with elements we loved in Pillars of Eternity. At the time, numerous rumors and speculations suggested that the game could be a continuation of the Pillars universe, but with a first-person perspective, possibly with a more brutal and intense approach to mechanics. Many hoped for something special, a continuation of those dark, morally complex, and brutal elements that made Pillars of Eternity so captivating. And what if they added elements reminiscent of Tyranny, where every choice had real consequences, but in a new, more dynamic context? That would have been a real gem. And so we've reached February 17th, 2025. Just recently, on February 14th, the long-awaited game was released, priced at a hefty €90. So what did we end up getting? And what we got was something like this. Now let me say it straight away. Avowed is a victim of comparisons with more successful peers. Avowed is an attempt by Obsidian to adapt the world of Eora, familiar from Pillars of Eternity, into a more dynamic first-person format. It's a significant step toward action, but did it manage to retain the depth inherent in RPGs? The answer, unfortunately, is mixed. The game fell victim to my expectations, shaped by other projects like Baldur's Gate 3, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Skyrim, as well as games that Obsidian itself had created before. Although Avowed has its strengths, it doesn't quite reach the level of those games. Let's begin with the basics. The lore, and immersion in the world. Eora remains one of the strongest aspects of the game. The world's story is alive and detailed, and if you're a fan of Pillars of Eternity, you'll notice plenty of references and familiar elements. The lore-driven stories are rich in depth, and you don't need to have played the previous titles in the series to grasp what's going on. The character customization is also a highlight. You can create a truly unique character, which is always a valuable feature in RPGs. Combat system. The game offers a variety of approaches to battles. You can use magical spells, melee weapons, and even guns. The spells look impressive, and the animations are truly striking. However, despite this, the combat mechanics feel somewhat underdeveloped. Regardless of the weapon choice, battles often boil down to repetitive actions, where you simply poke enemies with the same move. This takes away from the strategic depth of combat that I was expecting, especially after Baldur's Gate 3, with its rich set of tactical options, and Kingdom Come Deliverance, with its realistic swordplay mechanics. There's no world in exploration. Unfortunately, the world of Avowed feels underdeveloped to me. The locations are not always varied, and the environment seems static. Exploration doesn't bring the excitement you might experience in other major RPGs. However, the developers have added parkour, which brings some dynamism and expands the movement and secret finding possibilities, and its implementation is quite good. Many compare Avowed to Skyrim, and this comparison does not work in the former's favor. In Skyrim, each location feels like a living organism, filled with factions, enemies, and hundreds of active quests. In Avowed, the world feels empty and lacking that same depth. Quest system. Many quests are too straightforward and fail to leave a lasting impression. Side missions often lack the level of detail and engagement that could make them memorable. This is especially noticeable, given the expectations from a studio known for its complex and multifaceted storylines. Dialogues and player influence. The dialogues with characters feel weak compared to Obsidian's previous projects. The choices the player makes don't always have a noticeable impact on the world, and the NPCs themselves sometimes lose depth. This creates the feeling that your actions don't carry much weight in shaping the story. Gameplay style. One of the main issues with Avowed is the lack of a unique style. If you line up Conquered, The Last Dragon Age, and Avowed, I would be hard-pressed to find any notable differences. A distinctive gameplay style is incredibly important. For example, if you take Skyrim, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Dragon's Dogma 2, and The Witcher, you can immediately tell which is which. In the case of Avowed, that's not the case. I might even confuse it with Fortnite. This is a significant flaw that robs the game of its individuality. In conclusion, Avowed is an ambitious project that tries to blend the depth of RPGs with dynamic action, but it doesn't always strike the perfect balance. On the one hand, the game delights with its well-developed lore, stunning spells, and vertical world exploration. On the other hand, it suffers from an underdeveloped world, a weak quest system, and shallow combat mechanics. If you're a fan of the Pillars of Eternity universe, or looking for an RPG with an interesting setting, Avowed might appeal to you. However, if you're expecting something truly innovative or deep, be prepared that the game may not meet all your expectations. That said, it's still enjoyable to play, and you won't waste your time. But before diving in, I'd recommend playing all the other games mentioned today to really appreciate the RPG world's flavor. That's all. My goal was to open up the world of quality RPGs for you, while sharing the story of Obsidian Entertainment and offering my thoughts on the newly released Avowed, and I hope I've succeeded in doing that. If you found it interesting, support my efforts with a like and a subscription. That would be the best reward for me. See you next time.